Welcome to What is Systems Thinking and Why Should You Care, Part 2. For those of you who were here on Tuesday, welcome back. It seems as though the Tuesday sessions always seem to scare a number of people away that just don't come back on Thursdays. I have to figure out what it is that I do to people and stop doing it. So, on Tuesday I talked, an introduction is to a perception of what systems thinking is and to an extent why it's important, what it entails. Today I want to talk about a little bit of review, and then I want to go over some qualitative and some quantitative models. This outline for this session is in fact accessible through the webinars page where you actually registered for this session itself. You can find this page from any page in Systems Wiki. It's right here on the navigation bar, and when you get to this page and look on the discussion tab, this outline, which is done in a piece of software called co-mapping, is embedded in the wiki page, and the outline is in fact hot so that you can open and close segments of it. And if you double click on a link, all the links are in blue and underlined, it will open whatever it is that's connected to that link in a new window, so that in addition to this webinar actually being recorded and it will be online within a couple hours after the session, if you want to go back and look at the individual pieces that I use to walk through the different aspects of this webinar, you can get to all of the pieces that I display during the webinar from this outline. And that will be true for some period of time into the future. The difficulty is that the content of Systems Wiki continues to evolve on a day-to-day basis, and that's why the outlines for all of the previous courses aren't here anymore, because they just got to be too out of date and too difficult to keep up with. So continuing to try to move forward. As indicated, the webinars are free. Donations to cover, small donations to help cover overhead are greatly appreciated. You can get to this screen from the donate link on the navigations tab in any page in Systems Wiki. I talked on Tuesday about there being two primary perspectives on what systems thinking is. At one point in time, I personally believed that systems thinking was a not very grown-up version of system dynamics, and it probably arrived at that point because I came into systems thinking through system dynamics. So that the development of causal loop diagrams to understand the nature of the relationships between things was perceived to be, excuse me, not this again. I had this throat problem last week. It was okay on Tuesday, but maybe it's back again today. So that the development of causal loop diagrams to help one understand the interaction, the relationships between things is perceived by a lot of people to be systems thinking. Well, the development of causal loop diagrams is in fact something that embraces the concept of systems thinking, but systems thinking itself, I have come to understand, is far broader than simply doing causal loop diagrams. And I am now quite comfortable with Jackson's framework to say that there are enormous number of models and methods for approaching the understanding of things which embrace the systemic perspective paradigm, and those are dependent upon the nature. Which ones tend to be most useful are dependent upon the context that one is trying to deal with a situation within. And I'm currently putting together for sometime next month to do 2 sessions to cover probably a dozen different models and methods which are considered to be systems thinking methods. And those will be posted on the webinar's website, and I'll send out notices so that people can sign up for that session next month. So the consistent thing, regardless of what the context or the method is, it is in fact always an attempt to understand the situation to a point where we can figure out how to deal with it, and hopefully deal with it in such a way that we don't actually make things worse or create more problems than we had when we started. So in order to do that, because reality is complex and complicated and most probably impossible to understand in totality, we develop models that help us understand. And it is, in fact, the extent to which a model helps us understand which dictates whether or not it's a good model or not. And this comment by George Box, which some people find meaningful and some people seem to be able to converse about endlessly going nowhere. All models are wrong, some models are useful. The fact that the model is a simplification of reality means that it cannot be exact. It is some simplification of that reality, so that you can't look at it and say that it is reality, so that it's, when compared to reality, it is wrong, though to the extent to which it helps me and others understand what's going on in this set of relationships, it can be useful. So that's why we develop models. That's why I develop models. And I commented on Tuesday that I run into an enormous number of people who claim to be systems thinkers and they never build any models, and it drives me nuts, because maybe it's what drives me nuts is my own incompetence, because anytime that it gets beyond a couple of relationships, I absolutely get lost in the relationships and I can't keep track of things. And before this session's over, I'll show you something that a half a dozen of us are currently working on, and maybe it'll give you the difficulty with a lot of the things that I'm going to show you today is that we already worked them out. But I'll go ahead and show you one that's in the midst of an enormous amount of chaos at the moment, because it's not been worked out. It's work in progress. So when I talk about building models, there are lots of different kinds of models that one can build. Here are a group of models that I have figured out how to build with something called Insight Maker. Today I'm going to talk about causal loop diagrams and stock and flow diagrams. I'm not going to talk about how to build them as much as I'm going to talk about the implications of using them. You will find that I am a fanatical is probably a good word. My wife says I'm obsessed. A fanatical advocate of Insight Maker. Not because it's the best simulation package on the market, and not because it's the best drawing package on the market, but because it's web-based, meaning that when I develop a model, I can share it with someone else and get their comments. All I have to do is send them a URL. And I don't have to worry about, do they have the software that I developed the model with? It's very easy to share it. I can, in fact, provide other people with access so that they can actually work on the same model that I'm working on. And maybe not best of all, but extremely important, is the fact that it's free. So, I mean, one has difficulty arguing with the cost-benefit analysis because it's free. So this particular page, Modeling and Simulation with Insight Maker, is a reference page for your reference, which has 40-odd videos. Every one of these links is to a page that has videos and links to models. So if you go to Bathtub Model Part 1, that page, in fact, contains a video, and all of the videos are, I don't know, 8 to 12 minutes long. A video with some notes and links to the specific elements that are part of that video. So I'm doing another session the week after next which is in fact 2 sessions on modeling and simulation with InsightMaker itself, and I will walk through actually building several different types of models in InsightMaker. So if you're interested in becoming more familiar with InsightMaker in that level of depth, go to the webinars page and sign up for that session. I just scheduled the sessions last night, so you wouldn't have seen it previously. In addition to, oh, I hate it when that happens. In addition to sorry, there's this thing about GoToWebinar. When I define the window that I want it to record, if anything becomes active outside of that window, it makes the recording window bigger and actually then ends up shrinking what gets displayed at the end. So this video may or may not come out well. And I've talked to them about it, and they said, we understand, but we're not going to fix it. So I said that there were a number of models that I have figured out how to create with InsightMaker. There are, in fact, probably more that I can create with InsightMaker. I just haven't spent the time to do that. There's a very nice course offered by Scott Page from the University of Michigan called Models Thinking, where it's a 10-week program with 20 sets of videos about different kinds of models and how one uses them to better understand situations. So that I provide that link because I've been through most of the videos and they're very well done. So if you want to investigate other types of models, have at it. Leave this page. Let me go to part 2. Causal loop diagrams are an outgrowth of system dynamics in that they were developed when members of the system dynamics community were looking for a way to represent some of the insights they had developed in a manner that wouldn't overwhelm the audience. If you look at very large stock and flow simulation models, the model itself can become very quickly overwhelming because of all of the detail that's in it. So they developed a method of representing the relationships between entities, and it's a qualitative picture of what's going on. It's the same representation that Senge used in the 5th discipline, though there are in fact 2 different notations. The notation that Senge used, if we take an influencing variable and an influenced variable, Senge uses an S and an O notation. The S meaning that the influenced variable changes in the same direction as the influencing variable, so that if this increases, then this increases. If this decreases, then this decreases. An O means that the influenced variable changes in the opposite direction, so that if the influencing variable increases, the influenced variable decreases, and the alternative. The other notation, which is an older notation, is a plus and minus notation, which is in fact, in my mind, more correct, though more complex, in that the definition is overloaded, because the plus sign means that the influencing variable adds to the influenced variable, or the influenced variable changes in the same direction as the influencing variable, and the alternative for the minus sign. You can specifically see the difference, or you can see the flaws in the S and the O notation, specifically if you look at a situation such as production and inventory. Production causes inventory to increase. If I reduce production and everything else stays the same, inventory still increases, it just doesn't increase as fast. So the S and the O notation in certain instances will in fact provide the wrong perspective on what's happening in the relationships, and it primarily has to do with the stocks, those quantities, those entities that represent amounts of stuff, like water in a bathtub or water in a swimming pool or grain in a grain elevator. It's an amount of stuff that's there as a result of stuff flowing in and out that is explicitly represented in stock and flow diagrams, though not generally represented in causal loop diagrams. So you'll see most of the diagrams that I do typically will have red and blue lines associated with them, and they won't have the plus and minus signs simply because in Insight Maker the plus and minus signs are not attached to the arrows, and it makes it just more difficult to continue to evolve the model. So I use a blue line for a positive or reinforcing influence and a red line for a negative or balancing influence. So though because they're called causal loop diagrams, there probably ought to be some loops here someplace. So the two basic kinds of loops that can exist with causal loop diagrams are a reinforcing loop and a balancing loop. Reinforcing loop says that if I take action which produces a result, that result influences more of the same action that created it. So that the entity in the center is meant to help point out this is a snowball rolling downhill. This kind of a structure produces an exponential growth or decline because of the reinforcing nature of it. This particular structure where I have a target inventory and production and the gap between, I have a target inventory and an existing inventory, and the difference between these two produces a gap, and that gap influences production to change and either add to or subtract from inventory depending upon what the gap is, and the structure tends to bring the current inventory in line with the target inventory, and the structure creates a balance, which is why the balancing icon is in the center of it. So these are the only two kinds of causal loops that there are. So that anytime you run into a causal loop diagram that represents a set of interactions for something that you've labeled as a system, it's just a set of balancing and reinforcing structures woven together to create the behavior that comes out of that structure. Though, as I said before, they can also quickly become very overwhelming because of a large number of them. This particular model is a model of Aesop's fable for the boy who cried wolf. So that if I start out with a boy who wants attention and he's actually bored because he's tending sheep, it induces him to cry wolf because of an understanding that if he cries wolf, the townspeople will come running, will make him the center of attention, which relieves the boredom. Though that's not the end of the story. If he cries wolf and there is no wolf, that represents a lie, which tends to reduce the belief-o-meter, which tends to reduce the likelihood of the townspeople coming running in the future. Now note that the belief-o-meter being positive would increase the likelihood, but because it's being reduced, it adds less to the likelihood of the townspeople come running. In addition to that, if he cries wolf and there is a wolf, then that actually increases the belief-o-meter, which increases the likelihood of the townspeople coming running. And as this diagram stands at the moment, it's what's referred to as a rich picture. A rich picture is a type of causal loop diagram that doesn't adhere to the set of guidelines for drawing causal loop diagrams, in that the influences don't have to be reinforcing or balancing. The influences can be anything that you want them to be, and instead of just using text, it generally uses pictures to make the diagram more engaging. So the real benefit of closed loop diagram, of rich pictures, is that you don't have to follow a set of rules or a set of guidelines to put them together, which is also the bad thing about them, because usually if you develop rich pictures, you have to explain to somebody how to read them when you get done with them. Turning this rich picture into a real causal loop diagram simply takes adding the additional pieces to it, so that this is in fact a boredom relief loop. It's a balancing loop. When I go back to here, the difference between a reinforcing loop and a balancing loop are identified based upon the number of balancing influences in the loop. If there is an odd number of balancing influences, it's a balancing loop. If there are 0 or an even number of balancing influences, it's a reinforcing loop. So looking at this structure from here, it's a a reinforcing, 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 and one balancing, so it's an odd, so it's a balancing loop. And the purpose of the loop is to relieve boredom. If we look at this loop, it's positive, negative, positive, positive, negative, positive. So there are 2 balancing influences in the loop, and they cancel out. So this is in fact a reinforcing loop, and it's a reduced belief loop. For this loop, which is plus, 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 1 negative, plus, and another plus, there is only 1 negative in the loop, so that it is a balancing loop, and it's an improved belief loop. So that I swore for a long time that I was going to do this, because I've always thought that Aesop's Fables is one of the best books on systems ever written, and I swore that I would go do some of the Aesop's Fables as system diagrams. So I finally got to one. There's a whole bunch more that I'd really like to do when I get a chance. So there is The Boy Who Cried Wolf as a causal loop diagram. This particular home heating system represented as a causal loop diagram. I begin with a comparison between the thermostat and the current temperature, which creates a gap which influences the furnace to run to increase the current temperature to make the gap smaller, and when the current temperature reaches the thermostat temperature, the gap is 0 and the furnace doesn't run anymore. It's actually a bit more detailed than that, though the extent of the detail that you put into the model depends upon what it is that you're trying to understand. You never want to make the model more complicated than is necessary to develop the understanding that you're trying to gain, which means it's difficult to understand what that is, and sometimes you have to put things in and find out that you didn't need them and take them out. After 30 years of developing system diagrams, it still takes repeated iterations over and over and over again to work out the thoughts as to what the relationships really are, and which ones are meaningful and which ones I don't need to put in the model for what I'm currently trying to understand. It's an iterative process, and as I've told people about the simulations that I develop, it's at times a love-hate relationship between me and my models, because I develop the model and I explain to it what I think I understand, and then the thing that you'll see about simulation models is they give you an implication of the interactions over time, as opposed to qualitative models like causal loop diagrams, which simply give you a snapshot of the relationships. They're static. Nothing's changing. There are no values associated with all the pieces. So when I do simulation models, I go ahead and run them, and far too often the simulation says, either your model is wrong or your assumptions are wrong, because reality cannot possibly be this absurd. Go think about it some more. And my models and I go around like that on an ongoing basis until either I get it figured out or I decide to go build a model of something else. So in terms of the home heating system, this is the core structure of it, though at the same time that that's happening, there is in fact a desired level of comfort that I'm interested in, and I compare that with where the thermostat is set, and that, well, my desired level of comfort is associated with the current temperature, which creates a gap, which influences me. I'm actually part of the system to turn the thermostat up if it is that I'm not as comfortable as I would like to be, and then that figures right into the loop that I've already defined. So here is in fact another balancing loop, because if you look at the structure, there is only one balancing influence in the loop. So I've turned it, I'm assuming that it's winter time, and I've turned the thermostat up because and I moved to North Carolina from upstate New York, in one of the places that gets far more snow than I like to deal with. At the same time that this is happening, there is in fact a cost associated with doing this, which interacts with what I consider to be an acceptable cost. That gap influences me to turn the thermostat down, which then reduces this gap, causing the furnace to run less, using less energy, reducing the cost. Though this cycle has a substantial delay in it because it takes a month for me to get the bill, and then I get sticker shock, and I say, oh, I can't afford to spend this money on energy on a monthly basis, so I begin to sacrifice desired comfort for acceptable cost, and I turn the thermostat back down, and it goes by for another month, and I get the energy bill, and I say, well, I'm doing really good, so maybe I can go ahead and in fact satisfy some of my desired comfort a little bit more, and I turn the thermostat back up for the next month, and then I get sticker shock again. So the system, this structure has a tendency to oscillate back and forth because of my short-term memory. And with this set of components as they are, there isn't a way out of the predicament. The way out of the predicament is to realize that it is in fact the leakage from the house and the interaction with the outside temperature which causes the current temperature to be funneled off or siphoned off, so that the warm air escapes from the house and the cold air outside comes in. And if I in fact want to deal with my oscillating predicament, it is in fact to figure out how to reduce the leakage for the house itself by improving the storm windows, or insulating the attic, or insulating the walls, because the house was built in 1935 and they didn't put any insulation in it, and I mean a whole ton of different things. So this is a perspective. Is it complete? No, but it gives me a view of the interactions that I simply could not hold on to if I wrote this all out in text and tried to follow it. I need the picture. Here's one called Managing Time in Time Management. I have lots of things to do, and I have an amount of time available to do them in, which is usually less than necessary to do all these things, so it creates time pressure. As a result, I take action, and after some delay, it reduces the things to do. So this is a balancing structure. Me attempting to get all the things done that Panos has a question. Do gaps represent flow parameters in home heating system model? Do gaps? Oh, I think the question is about the gaps that are in this model. The gaps are in fact not anything real. They are simply put there allow me to say that I compare the two of these, and the difference between them creates a gap, and it's that gap that influences me. I could have wired acceptable cost and cost directly into me, because that's the way it actually factors in. It was just a variable put in to allow me to explicitly identify the gap. Does that take care of it, Panos? Good. So there simply isn't enough time available to get all the things done that I need to do. And what happens is that as I do those things, it reduces the time available, and it gets to a point where I still got things to do, and I can't get them all done. So I push myself harder and harder, and it results in stress or burnout, reduces my effectiveness, and when that happens, it in fact has a negative impact on the things to do, because I don't get as many of them done as I would in the same time frame. So this reinforcing structure is not a good reinforcing structure, because it is in fact going to make it more difficult for me to address all the things that I have to get done. And while that's happening, well, because I'm not getting everything done, I begin to sacrifice some of my own personal time to make more time available to get things done, which does, for a period of time, allows me to get more stuff done because I have more time to work with. But in the process of doing that, the personal time is what usually allows me to recover from my stress and burnout. So if I give up the personal time, I am in fact more likely to experience stress and burnout, reducing my effectiveness. And so what happens is somebody introduces me to time management, and I say, lo and behold, I have time in my life because I have figured out how to manage all of the things that I need to do, and now I have some time available. The difficulty is, what do we do when we have time available? We in fact create more things to do. It's just, we are the victims of ourselves. So this is a thought I had about managing time and time management. There was a story in a book called Complex Systems in Time, or something like that. And there was a story in it about an organization who had an accounts receivable period that was unacceptable. It was like 53 days or something like that. And management said to the accounts receivable department that you either figure out how to get the accounts receivable average period down to 51 days, or we're going to fire you. So after they worked at it intently for a period of time, they didn't manage to get the accounts receivable period down to an acceptable level, and management did in fact fire them and give the job to some more poor people. Though when somebody came in and finally decided to study the situation, they found out that what was happening was that because of the sales goals, current sales, the salespeople were positioning the customers and telling them that they could delay the payment. You just go ahead and buy the stuff, and it's okay if you delay the payment. So sales is positioning the customers to delay payments to help them meet their own sales goals, which is in fact making things worse for the accounts receivable department, who is actively trying to get the customers to pay their bills. And because of the difference between the sales goals and the desired accounts receivable department, there's no way out of this mess. They're working at counter purposes to each other. And I diagrammed this story and I explained it to somebody, and in the process of explaining it to them, all of a sudden I realized that while this is not the answer, it seems to be an answer. So that if if because of the carrying cost, the company believes that it's losing a small fortune on carrying the accounts receivable, that by simply reducing the accounts receivable by a couple of days, they would make a tremendous amount of money. So if the company, in fact, introduced a payment plan and discounts which would influence sales positively, because I mean, those people who are purchasing from us would be more interested in purchasing the same things with a discount, which would improve revenue and profit. So I could offer them a payment plan and discounts, and if I allowed them to pay over a period of 8 weeks as opposed to all at once, 8 weeks is a little bit less than the 56 is a bit more than the total accounts receivable period. But when you figure it out, having them do equal payments over a period of 8 weeks, it actually reduces the accounts receivable by 42%. And previously they couldn't reduce it by 2 days. And if you implement that plan, it reduces the accounts receivable, which reduces the carrying cost, which improves the profit, so that you end up with 2 reinforcing loops going in the same direction, so that both groups are in fact working in the same direction, supporting each other's success. So it's a perspective, and that's the only reason I'm offering is it's just a way of viewing by understanding what was happening, there was a thought that emerged. And next week when I do, give me a couple more slides and I'll get to the other part that I want to do. There is a company called Network Magic, which is a small high-tech startup company which has introduced a set of network routers that has a very attractive function price point for customers, and they have been experiencing growing demand for the past 2 years, growing so rapidly that customer support has found it almost impossible to staff and train and develop resources fast enough to keep up with customer demand and be able to create a level of customer satisfaction that they would like to maintain. And at the same time, customer support is having these problems. Other organizations within the company are having the same kinds of resource problems, and what they have figured out is the best place to acquire resources to fill their demand is to steal them from customer support, which makes customer support's life even worse. And what the company is concerned about is that this resource shortage could in fact limit the potential growth of the company overall, and it may never reach the potential that it's attempting to reach. From a causal loop diagram perspective, I put together this diagram to say that there's a level of support readiness and desired support that creates a gap which induces them to hire and train resources, which creates a trained support staff that works with a customer to help them maintain a level of readiness. At the same time that's going on, the other organizations within the company have employees required and current employees, and that creates an employee gap. And as a result of that, they raid resources from support to fill their needs to add to their current resources, so that support and the other organizations are in fact at odds with each other. This is a view of this particular predicament. The 2 sessions that I'm doing next week take the systemic perspective model, which I'll show you in a minute, and walk through this company in all the segments of that model and how one looks at this particular situation, diagrammed here as a rich picture and here as a causal loop diagram, to in fact arrive at a number of approaches to dealing with this situation that are likely to improve the situation and not make matters worse. So that's those are the pieces that I wanted to offer as examples of causal loop diagrams, ways to go ahead and look at a set of interactions to get a better sense of what's really happening in the mix. In terms of what I said a moment ago, here is that's the wrong one. Here's a model that there's a whole bunch of us currently trying to figure out in terms of when does it make sense to invest and when does it make sense to pursue austerity in an environment to promote economic growth. And we've been working on this for a week or so. And you know, at the moment we have bunches of pieces, and we're looking at the relationships between them and adding notes about things that we don't understand that we need to go figure out. And there are extremely smart people around the world working on this problem. We're working on it because we would like to understand the problem better than we do. Is it likely that we are going to come up with an earth-shattering answer? No. Though it is likely that when we get done, we will understand the situation much better than we understand it at the moment. And that's the reason for pursuing it. Let me now go ahead and talk about a couple of quantitative models, and that this particular model, which I may have touched on a bit on Tuesday, I'm not sure, is a model of a consulting company that has 120 employees, 60 of them being rookies and 60 of them being professionals, and they bill out the professionals at $15K a month and the rookies at $5K a month, and the company wants to maintain 120 employees, and a number of pros currently quit every month, so every pro that quits, they hire a rookie so that the number of employees is maintained. And it takes a period of time for rookies to be trained to become pros. And initially, this is, as opposed to a causal loop diagram, this is a stock and flow diagram. Stock and flow diagrams have extremely explicit rules for how you can connect things to other things. There are stocks, which represent quantities of things which can only change because of inflows or outflows. They have variables which represent constants or equations for the way things are calculated. And the model is intended to run over a time period with a step size, so that once you put the model together, it does explicitly what you tell it to do. It's like a software program. It's not random unless you build randomness into the model, which can in fact be done. But when you run this model for the initial setup, it's just like watching paint dry. There are 60 rookies, there are 60 pros, and there are 10 pros that quit every month. But if you in fact say that at some period of time, the number of pros that quit every month changes from 10 to 15, what's the impact that that has on the model itself? Well, generally, when people are explained this model and asked about that change, their answers are in fact different than what actually happens in the model. In that change happened at month 10, and with that one step change, the model itself began a transition over a 6-month period, and at the end of the 6-month period, there were 90 rookies and 30 pros left in the organization. The reason for that is that this stock called rookies is actually a conveyor, and it takes 6 months for a newly hired rookie to advance to become a pro. So as there are more and more pros quitting on a monthly basis, the organization is stocking up on rookies, and it's taking a 6-month period, 6-month time frame for them to, in fact, develop to become pros. And at the same time that the rookie-pro ratio is changing, the revenue ratio of the company is, the overall revenue is declining because the makeup of rookie and pro contribution is changing. So that a single step change within the model causes a number of things to change, and the model, in fact, stabilizes at someplace other than where it was. So that there are times when, if you jar a model, it will vibrate a bit and it will go back to where it was. It will restabilize at the same point. And then sometimes when you jar a model, it may shake and oscillate back and forth, and then it will stabilize someplace else. And it may not stabilize at all, depending upon the nature of the interactions in the model. Another one, this one is a bit more complex in that it has to do with an organization which initially is set up so that it's in a steady state. There is a desired performance, an actual performance, and the gap between that is zero, and the organization spends time working, and it spends time developing its capability, and its capability erodes over time, so that in an initial state, nothing, well, it's not that nothing is happening. The organization is, in fact, in a steady state, so that this is the desired performance and the actual performance is the same. So there is no performance gap, and that the time spent working is a constant, and the time spent on improvement is a constant, and the cost of operation is a constant. Though if one then introduces a change in the desired performance for this model and runs it again, one notices that while the desired performance changed in a step change, similar to what happened in the rookie and pro model, there were a lot of changes that got set off in this model, in that the actual performance increased, and actually increased more than it needed to, and then it settled back down to where it needed to be for what was desired. There was a performance gap that increased, and then because of the overcompensation, it actually declined and then came back up to a constant value. And the time spent working, time spent on improvement went up, the time spent working went up, but they then came back down. This model is set up in such a way that you can use it to test the implications of spending, because when there is a performance gap, the organization can choose to spend more time working or spend more time on improving their capacity, their capability to do work, and to compare the difference between the two, so that based upon that step increase, if the organization decided to spend an additional 25% on improvement and 75% on work, and looked at the difference, you notice that the cost of operation increases and stays up, because they're not investing in their own capacity development. They're just working more to in fact attain the actual performance that they're looking for. Whereas if they had spent more time If they spent 75% of the time on improvement and only 25% of the time on working harder, you notice that at the end result of that, their cost of operation after they got to the new performance level is actually less than it was when they started, because they were in fact improving their capability to do work. So this is a model that was developed based upon a paper that we found from MIT, and a couple of us worked on this model back and forth, and it took us a couple of weeks to get from what was in the paper to actually come up with a model that allowed us to investigate the implications of those interactions. It's not a model that was built for a specific organization. For a particular organization, one would have to backfit the model with the specifics that were relevant to the environment that was being modeled. This is simply a generalized perspective. So, can you show us some of the mathematical functions in your models, flows, stocks? Okay. In this particular model, the difference between actual and desired performance is a gap. It's just the difference between them. Insight Maker has a whole set of mathematical functions that you can put into the model. Here are all of the trig functions and rounding functions and sum and max and min. You can look at the time that the model is actually flowing. You can do delays and smoothing functions. You can do random distributions. You can build in if-then-else structures into the model. Here, this is simply based upon the slider itself, the slider that I moved over here, so that this has whatever value is assigned by the slider. But to look at the available hours, in other words, there's a cost of hours and an hours limit. The available hours, that's the available minus the total hours. The change in work, this one gets a little bit more complicated in terms of looking at having to understand the difference between the change that's the change in the time spent working and the change in the time spent on improvement, because there's the hours used and it has to either add hours or take hours away, as well as add time spent on improvement or take time away from improvement. So both of those equations are relatively complex with embedded if-then-else structures based upon other elements in the model. So that, I mean, that the models can get extremely complex, though. As I said before, no matter how complex or complicated the model is perceived to be, it's still just a bunch of balancing and reinforcing structures cobbled together to create the relationships that you're trying to understand. Is there a way to see all of the, Philip asks, is there a way to see all of the equations or program at the same time? You can look at right here, it says equations, and this will give you all of the equations along with the notes that have been embedded about each one of, and you can copy and paste this into Word or Google Docs or someplace else. So, okay. For one more model that I'd like to spend a couple of minutes on is called Swamping Insights. This has to do with a situation where for individuals out of work, families, there's a group of people that provide temporary assistance to them to, in fact, help them find work. And for the way that the model was set up initially, if we run it, this families on temporary assistance, that number is continuing to climb over time. And because the the number of families on temporary assistance is climbing, this group of individuals believes that, or it believes that they're not doing their job, or maybe it looks to other people like they're not doing their job. So what they decide to do is, in fact, increase their capacity, so that they want to do a 10% increase in their capacity to do their job. And when you run the model, what happens is that, well, when you introduce that increase in capacity, it does in fact bring the number down, but the number still goes back up. So because I increased my capacity and it helped, maybe I should just increase my capacity some more, and it'll help some more. And I run the model again, and well, it did. It in fact took it way down, but then it actually got worse than it was before. So what is it that's going on? This is the typical situation where the situation being experienced is in fact due to multiple organizations operating and not talking to each other. So that when this organization, does Insight Maker support any programming language for further development? You can embed JavaScript on components in the model. So I'm not sure that completely answers your question, Panos, but that's, at the moment, all that's available is to be able to create buttons with JavaScript on them. I was talking about, there are in fact two different organizations here. The blue is one organization and the orange is another organization. And when this organization provides assistance and families initially find a job, they move to another stock, which is another level of assistance provided by another organization who works with them to actually migrate into mainstream employment. And if they don't migrate into mainstream employment, they in fact go back to the stock that they came from initially. And what's happening in this particular situation is that the first organization is improving their capacity to help these people find jobs, but they're overloading the second organization. Where is it? This is the first group, and this is the second group. So what they're doing is they're overloading the second group, and their numbers are getting better because the people are in fact going back to the first group. So if the first group continues to improve their capacity to deal with the situation, the overall situation is simply going to get worse on an ongoing basis. The answer to the situation is for the second group to actually improve its performance. And if that happens, the first group's performance gets better. So it's simply an example of applying leverage in the wrong place in the system, because the group that's trying to apply leverage is only paying attention to part of the set of interactions that are responsible for the situation. Any other questions? I know it's a lot of I'm sorry, it's a lot of stuff in an hour. I'll go along with that. So in terms of in various pages in Systems Wiki, there are about 250 Insight Maker models that you can look at for a lot of different things, and there are new ones created on an ongoing basis. There are also a couple thousand of them in Insight Maker itself. The nice thing about Insight Maker, I said that it was actually a web-based modeling and simulation language. Because it's web-based, It was set up so that you can also keep track of, or it keeps track of everybody that edits anything. And at the bottom of the entry page, you can look through all of the models that were modified in the last week. So here is Swamping Insights, which I just modified a couple of minutes ago. It's now at the top of the list. The Credit Never Happened, Rookie Pro, Investment Austerity. All right, here are all the ones that I was dealing with during this session, and you can walk through this and you can just look at stuff that other people are working on. Some of it's really good and some of it. And there are times when, you know, this is supply and demand stock and flow diagram, and this might be one of mine, it might be one of somebody else's, I don't know. So I continue to promote Insight Maker, as I said, because it's extremely capable, allows people to share models, and I think we should build more models, and it's free. So, as I said, webinars are free, donations greatly appreciated. This 2 sessions next week are specifically to walk through all of the elements of this model piece by piece and use Network Magic as a company and evolve that example through every stage of this model and talk about why I think the model makes sense and provide an example of why it makes sense. So I invite you to, if you haven't already, go to this page and sign up for the sessions for next week, which are now being called Systemic Strategy Development. One day, hopefully, I'll figure out what it's really appropriate to be called. That also continues to evolve on an ongoing basis. Where do I find model thinking in Coursera? Okay. Well, let's see. Panos says, could you run simultaneously the model to dynamically see the growth and changes? Panos, you can have as many of those windows open, the model windows or the diagram windows open as you want, so that you can run the model and look at the graphs that it develops and leave that window open and change the variables and run it again, and then have the 2 graphs side by side so that you can look at them. And there's also a way to do sensitivity analysis, though that was a bit much to squeeze into here. Colleen asked, what if you create a model and you don't want anyone to change it? All right, when you create a model, it belongs to you and nobody else has the right to change it unless you explicitly give them the right to change it. And you can also make it unpublished so that nobody else can even see it, which I think sort of defeats the purpose of Insight Maker to begin with, though there are some people who, you know, want to work with the model to get it to a point where they're willing to let other people throw stones at it. And there are some models which have proprietary information in it that they don't want other people to see it. So when you create it, it's not modifiable by anyone unless you explicitly allow them to modify it. Where do I find model thinking in Coursera? The easiest way to find it, Joseph, is on the wiki page, on any one of the wiki page. Simply go to Learning, and at the bottom of the Learning links, under References, it's right here. Can stock and flow models deal with logarithmic functions? Colleen wants to know if the stock and flow models can deal with logarithmic functions, and the answer is yes. If you, that's the wrong pieces. I don't have a model open at the moment. Yes, the log functions are built in. Any other questions? Well, I thank you much. I hope you found it informative. As I continue to do them over and over again, I think I begin to understand it a little better. So I appreciate you bearing with me as I develop my own understanding, and hopefully it helps you also. And hope to see you next week on Tuesday and Thursday. So take care all. Have a great weekend. Bye.